All right. Good noon, everybody, and welcome back to God Was Here, our study of the life of Christ as recorded in the books of Matthew, Mark, and Luke. We've just now gotten into the Sermon on the Mount, one of the most important sermons that we see in the life of Christ, one of the most important sermons in the Bible. And it is fascinating. I probably spend more time preaching from the Sermon on the Mount than any other one section of Scripture. It is absolutely fascinating and definitely deserves to be broken up into several parts like we are doing. Last time we talked about the Beatitudes. Those are the places where Jesus says, "Blessed are those who," insert whatever, right? And "blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted," whatever. There's a lot of different ones of those. Highly encourage you to go back and listen to that as well. But today, I've been excited for this one. We're going to be going over the section known as the Antitheses. Now, I say I probably preach more out of the Sermon on the Mount than anything else. Well, among the Sermon on the Mount, I probably preach more out of the Antitheses than anything else. If you're following along in our Bibles, Matthew chapter 5 is pretty much where we're going to be camping out. Matthew certainly has the most thorough account of the Sermon on the Mount in general, and certainly this section. And part of the reason it fascinates me so much is it's in many ways the opposite, no pun intended. These are called the antitheses because they're opposites, but it's very much the opposite of the Beatitudes. The Beatitudes, in one sense, are very easy, but in another sense are difficult because it's hard to understand exactly what they're talking about. And, I mentioned last time, there are a lot of things within the Beatitudes where there's really a lot of openness to the meaning of it. Somebody might have a completely different thought as to what is meant by this. In fact, I had somebody comment on the last one talking about how they thought my interpretation of "blessed are those who mourn," they thought differently. There was no animosity or anything like that. I certainly didn't have any, and I didn't detect anything of the sort because there's nothing really to get angry about with this, because the Beatitudes just really deserve a lot of time to chew on. This section that we're going to get into, it's kind of the opposite. You don't have to be a brain surgeon to figure out what Jesus is talking about in this section. It's not difficult to understand, but it might be some of the most difficult things Jesus ever said when it comes to application. So we'll talk about that as we get into it. I did want to say this, though. A few months ago, Brooke, my wife, and we made a trip for our anniversary over to New York. Neither of us had been before. It's not all that far from us. We thought, well, we ought to at least say we've been to New York at some point in our life. So we went. One of the things we did over there was go to the 9/11 Museum, which is, I mean, it's definitely an experience worth having if you're American or not, and you happen to be near New York. I recommend doing that. Not because it's fun, but I think it's an experience worth having. You see, the way they've set that up is there's this, basically a square, One World Trade Center, and where the towers were formerly, they have now two gigantic downward-facing fountains. And the museum is actually underneath those fountains at the at the very foundations of where the towers were. Eventually, we had to leave. My wife just wasn't able to emotionally take it anymore. It's an extremely emotional place. But one thing I thought was so interesting, there was one little display encased in plastic, but it showed somebody's pocket Bible. The heat had fused it to a girder, and on it was, and you couldn't see what chapter or book it was, but you could see there was a little heading beforehand, and just from the heading I instantly knew it was Matthew chapter 5. And it's Jesus saying, "You have heard that it was said to those of old, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, but I say to you, do good to the one who curses you." Man, part of the nature of the Bible is that you could go almost anywhere in the Bible and you'd find something profound. I just randomly opened up to 2 Kings chapter 23. Um, and Hey, look at this, verse 26. Still the Lord did not turn from the burning of his great wrath by which his anger was kindled against Judah because of all the provocations which Manasseh had provoked him. That's an entire sermon. If you know the background about that, there's a great sermon there about how even if you have somebody who is good, a good man in the right position, sometimes that doesn't undo all the evil of people who've been there before, such as Josiah and Manasseh, if you understand the context of that. My point with that is this, though. You can just open up the Bible and almost instantly there is something profound. So it could be entirely coincidental, but the thing that got me about it is it just so happens that this section that is in here is the part of the Bible I've preached more than anything else. That is a big coincidence, and I don't know. There's something about that that shook me up pretty badly. But it's not. There's something about the nature of this. It is so extremely profound, yet so simple. Okay, I've built it up enough. We really need to get into this because I want. If you've never studied this before, man, now is the time to do it. So we are in Matthew chapter 5. We're actually going to cover a couple of things before we get into it, but I think they kind of fall under the category of preamble to the Antitheses. Matthew chapter 5, beginning in verse 13. You are the salt of the earth, but if salt has lost its taste, how shall its saltiness be restored? It's no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled under people's feet. You are the light of the world. A city on a hill cannot be broken, nor do people light a lamp and put it under a basket, but on a stand, and it gives light to all the house. In the same way, let your light shine before others, so that they may see your good works and give glory to your Father who is in heaven. First thing I want to mention is a little bit of a contradiction that you're going to see later within the Sermon on the Mount. And by contradiction, I mean apparent contradiction, but there's an apparent contradiction that happens there because you see Jesus says, let your light so shine and let others see it. Yet other places in the Sermon on the Mount, he says, don't do good just to be seen. And this isn't actually a contradiction, as I've said, but it tells us that we have to be able to understand the nuance and the difference. Sometimes it's good for people to be seen, but we need to understand where the glory is going to it. If the glory would be going to you, don't let anybody see your good works. There's no purpose to that. But if the glory is going to be going to the Father, which Jesus talks about here, then that's a good thing. So sometimes good works can be used to glorify God instead of glorifying ourselves. That's not to say that the only purpose of good works is to do that, but it can be a benefit. Anyway, Jesus says we are salt. It is something that changes the entirety of the food item. It makes it better. Same thing with light. And this one, I think, is a little bit more direct, that a city set on a hill cannot be hidden. Here is the idea. People are to be looking towards Christians to understand what God would have us do. So that's a huge responsibility. Now, I think this becomes a little more clear as preamble to it when we get to the next section, verse 17. Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. For truly I say to you, until heaven and earth pass away, not an iota, not a dot, will pass from the law until all is accomplished. Therefore, whoever relaxes one of the least of these commandments and teaches others to do the same will be called the least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever does them and teaches them will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. For I tell you, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and the Pharisees, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. We're going to try not to spend too much time on this section, but it's a pretty big one because, again, Jesus is introducing nuance to us, because one of the big things that's going to be coming up in this section is differences between Old and New Testament, or at least apparent differences between New and Old Testament. When we get to them, I'm going to make the argument that the antitheses are actually applicable in both Old and New Testament when we get there. But Jesus, of course, within his lifetime did teach us certain things, and certainly the apostles taught us certain things which would be contradictory to the Old Testament were it still in effect. This is Jesus introducing the nuance to us of what he came to do. He did not come, as he said, to abolish the law and the prophets, but that doesn't mean a lot of people want to stop there and see there we still need to follow the Old Testament. By the way, if you didn't know, the term law and prophets, when it shows up in the New Testament, that's what they called the Old Testament. He said, I didn't come to abolish the Old Testament. I didn't come to destroy the law and the prophets, but to fulfill them. The nuance there is one is a law breaker, one is somebody who is actually following the law. The illustration that the Apostle Paul uses in the book of Romans is that of a person whose spouse dies. You have a person on, let's say, on your left. Person on your left is going to get remarried while their spouse is still alive. They haven't divorced or any for scriptural reasons or anything like that. They're just divorced, or I'm just going to go get married. What have you done? You've committed adultery, right? Because you are still you still have a covenant with somebody else, and that's breaking the law. Jesus didn't come to break the law. He said, I came to fulfill it. Again, that illustration from Romans, Paul says that if somebody's spouse dies, they are free from the law, right? I'm a married man. If I died, my wife is free to remarry. She's not breaking the law because the law has been fulfilled. When we were married, we said that we would be together until death parts us. That's how long the marriage lasts. Once one of us dies, that is fulfilled. And that's what Jesus says he's come to do. He's not here to be a lawbreaker. I haven't come here to break the law. You might have a version that says destroy the law or abolish the law. I would like the word break there because, for us, in our idioms, that's what makes most sense to us. I have not come to break the law, but to fulfill the law. So a lot of the things that Jesus teaches and his disciples teach are different than the Old Testament. And thank goodness. I'm glad that we don't have to do a lot of things they did in the Old Testament. Aren't you glad that you're allowed to eat bacon? Isn't that a wonderful thing? Isn't it great that you don't have to sacrifice animals on a yearly basis and for all your sins and for the sins of your family, and you don't have to go through all this complex tax code and all of that, and you don't have to be proselytized to the nation of Israel, if that's ever what us Gentiles actually had to do. I don't want to get into that. Point is, we have a new law and it's a better covenant. But Jesus says that I have fulfilled it. So if you see anything in this next section that looks like it's contradicting the Old Testament, again, I'm going to make the argument that it actually doesn't contradict the Old Testament. But if you see something that looks like it's doing that, keep in mind, Jesus is coming to fulfill that old law. So, all right. Further ado, so for those two bits of preamble, Jesus said, I expect more from you as Christians. You're supposed to be the best the world has. And then he said, I've come to fulfill that old law. And this is partially what that's going to look like. Okay. Matthew chapter 5, beginning in verse 21, the first of the antitheses, anger. You've heard that it was said to those of old, you shall not murder, and whoever murders will be liable to the judgment. But I say to you, everyone who is angry with his brother will be liable to judgment. Whoever insults his brother will be liable to the council, and whoever says, you fool, will be liable to the hell of fire. So if you're offering your gift at the altar, there remember your brother has something against you, leave your gift there before the altar and go. First be reconciled to your brother, and come and offer your gift. Come to terms quickly with your accuser while you are going with him to court, lest your accuser hand you over to the judge, and the judge to the guard, and you be put in prison. Truly I say to you, you will never get out until you have paid the last penny. So, this is what Jesus says. You have heard that it was said, you shall not murder, and whoever murders shall be liable to the judgment. He is quoting Old Testament when he says you shall not murder. That is Exodus chapter 20. That is one of the 10 commandments. That's commandment number 6. He is not contradicting that idea, though, you'll notice. He's not saying, no, it's okay to murder. He's not taking it and loosing this. He's making it stricter. Now, again, we'll see that I think when he said this, that actually still applied in the Old Testament. I don't think there was ever a time in the Bible where it was okay to be angry at your brother without a cause. Now, the Bible has other things to say about anger, and we learn that there's, again, some nuance here. Jesus is not saying that under no circumstances ever should you be angry with somebody, but that it's something you ought to fight against, that there's ways to do it. The Bible also tells us to be angry, and let not the sun set in our wrath. Another place, Jesus says, he was angry at his brother without cause. Right? There's different reasons to be angry. Most of the time you're angry with somebody, it's not a good reason to be angry with them. Right? A little bit of inconsiderate behavior in traffic. Man, that burns me up. But the truth is, that's not something to really get angry about. There is such a thing as righteous indignation, and that is something to be angry about, but even then, it has to be something that is controlled, and not something you let fester within yourself. What Jesus is saying is that the problem starts with murder, not with the act of killing somebody else, but with the hatred towards them and all that anger that you allowed to build up within yourself. He tells Christians it's not good enough just to control yourself from killing somebody. You need to control yourself from wanting to kill somebody. Is that difficult to understand? I don't think so. Is it difficult to apply? Man, I got a lot of difficulty applying this one. Fighting against anger, that's a tough thing to do. But Jesus has told us he's expecting a lot from us here. Let's get to the next one here. I'm doing pretty good on time. I was afraid I was going to take way too long with this, but I think it's going to be pretty reasonable by the end. Matthew chapter 5, beginning in verse 27, is our next section. You've heard that it was said, you shall not commit adultery, but I say to you that everyone who looks at a woman with lustful intent has already committed adultery with her in his heart. If your right eye causes you to sin, tear it out and throw it away, for it is better that you lose one of your members than your whole body be thrown into hell. And if your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off and throw it away, for it is better that you lose one of your members than your whole body go to hell. Should mention, first of all, the absurdity of the idea that the Bible does not talk about hell. People say that, the word hell doesn't even show up in the Bible. And I suppose that's technically true, just like every other English word does not show up in the original Bible. The word here is Gehenna, which is a description being used to tell us what hell is like. It's very much like calling it the lake that burns with fire, which it does in other places. Gehenna was a burning trash heap outside of Jerusalem, essentially. It's funny to me that people spend so much time fighting against the concept of hell. There is nobody in the Bible who talks about hell more than Jesus himself. You will not find one of the apostles or disciples talking about hell nearly as much as Jesus talks about hell. It's such a fundamental doctrine of the Bible that there are two eternal locations that all human souls will go to, either one of them at the end of days, either heaven or hell. I find it interesting. Of course, nobody wants to fight against the concept of heaven. That's because it's not unpleasant. But hell is unpleasant, and people don't like unpleasant truths. Well, Jesus makes a good point. He says this: it is better for you to lose absolutely everything, even parts of your own body, than for you to be cast into hell. This stands in stark contradiction to what many modern religious Jews would say about the crime, or rather the sin of lust. Or let's be a little more specific here, use of pornography, which is, it's not everything that Jesus is talking about here, but it's certainly the number one way that I can think of that people today would be breaking the concept. Jesus says, yes, you've heard that it was good not to commit adultery. Once again, straight out of the Ten Commandments. That's commandment number 7. Great. But I say to you that you should not even lust after a woman. Don't even look at a woman to lust after her. This is not Jesus saying, by the way, you recognizing that somebody is attractive, but rather this is you intentionally placing your thoughts about that, and choosing to view somebody in a sexual way. Again, pornography use is the absolute easiest way to say to show this. I used to have a lot of trouble with this one because it seemed like there'd be some sort of unintentional sin. I don't think it is an unintentional sin. I think this is taught. Yes, it happens entirely within your mind, but it is something where people are making a conscious decision. I want to look at this person specifically to lust after them, or I want to think about this person specifically to lust after them. Again, there are some prominent modern day religious Jews who say that's a difference between Judaism and Christianity. In Christianity, you're not allowed to look at pornography, but in Judaism, it's just you can't commit adultery. You can look at a woman all you want, just as long as you know. That's not true. Well, let me be more specific. That's not true if the Jew wishes to be following only the Old Testament. If you saw my series on apostasies, we talked about Judaism, and you would know that most modern day Jews don't really just follow the Old Testament. Right? You have the Talmud, which is divided into two sections. A significant portion of it are these commentary on the scriptures by a couple of rabbis, not too long before the birth of Christ, and then the rest of it is a bunch of commentary on commentary, so it's evolved a good bit. To my knowledge, I don't think there is any sort of Jewish restorationist movement. Now, a true Jewish restorationist would become a Christian, and what I mean by that is somebody who desires to only follow the inspired scriptures. To my knowledge, I don't know of any Jewish restorationist movement. But if you were a Jewish restorationist, then you would know that that doesn't make any sense, because it is a direct violation of commandment number 10, which is, well, hold on, don't take my word for it. Let's look over to Exodus chapter 20 real quick. Look what it says. Verse 17, you shall not covet your neighbor's house, you shall not covet your neighbor's wife, or his male servant, or his female servant, or his ox, or his donkey, or anything that is your neighbor's. You might notice the emphasis added. Look, consumption of pornography is a terrible thing for a few reasons. But one of them is that you're lusting after something that isn't your own. I'm not saying that, by the way, in an unsympathetic way. I realize that a lot of people are addicted to pornography, but if that's you, listen, get help, get out of it, because I'm telling you, it does no good for you. It's a terrible thing. Anyway, Jesus says it wasn't good enough just to not commit adultery. You don't even lust after that sort of thing. You'll notice that's very similar to the first antithesis statement of the anger is just a lust for murder here, right? By the way, sometimes we oversimplify what lust means into just a sort of a sexual thing. While that is included within lust, lust is the intentional desire of something that one ought not have. I should not desire the death of my brother, and allowing such anger within me that I begin to do so, that's lust. Just the same as the lust over here for somebody in a sexual manner. All right. That's two of them. Third one. It begins in verse 31. It was also said, whoever divorces his wife, let him give her a certificate of divorce. But I say to you that everyone who divorces his wife, except on the grounds of sexual immorality, makes her commit adultery, and whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery. Jesus was against a divorce. A lot of times, a lot of so-called Christians can be very pro-divorce. I've even heard so-called Christians say that all divorces are good. Well, God certainly doesn't agree with that. Jesus says that you've heard that it was said to those of old, if someone wishes to divorce his wife, he ought to give her a certificate of divorce. Moses did say that. We're still talking about scriptural things here. Moses commanded that if you're going to divorce your wife, You have to give her a certificate of divorce. And the reason being is so that she has it, because you're in a society at the time where women cannot work to make a living. Um, if she is divorced and she can't prove that she was divorced, she'll have nowhere to go. She can't even go back to her father's household anymore because they'll say, no, your husband's problems. Well, now we have a certificate that says, actually, my husband kicked me to the curb. I'm going to starve to death if you don't help me out. So it was a way of protecting women in that case. But when you go back to that scripture, you'll also notice that it says, if some impurity is found in her. Now, this was a matter of great debate in the Jewish community for quite some time. Those two rabbis we mentioned, by the way, they only disagreed on a couple of points. I think maybe it was 3 points they didn't agree on, but this was one of them. Those two rabbis were called Hillel and Shammai, and I can't remember which one was which on this particular issue, but one believed that this meant you could divorce for any reason. Another believed that you could divorce only for sexual immorality. Essentially, what you have in this section is Jesus weighing in on that debate, and he says it pretty clearly. No, it was just for sexual immorality. Again, this is something that goes up into the Christian age. Unfortunately, this is something that stumbles a lot of people. Actually, all of these stumble people, but publicly, a lot of this one in particular, a lot of people do not have scriptural divorces. The only reason the Bible gives to divorce, and again, you can go to Matthew chapter 19 for Jesus to expound on this a little bit, but he's going to say essentially the same thing. The only reason Jesus says someone ought to be divorced is if the spouse commits adultery. That's the sexual immorality it's talking about. If your spouse doesn't cheat on you, God says you can't get divorced. Now, I realize that puts a lot of people in difficult positions, but again, look over to Matthew chapter 19, and we're going to get there, so I'm not going to try to talk too much about that right now. But he says very plainly, look, in Matthew chapter 19, look, there's more to life than sex. And if you get yourself into a position, if you've married the wrong person, and you end up being separated from that person, you can't get remarried. And yeah, that's bad, but there's more to life than sex. You're expected to make sacrifices if you're going to live the Christian life, right? That's what that whole prelude was at the very beginning. Salt and light. You got to make a couple sacrifices sometimes. Again, we'll get into that a little bit more later, but for now, let's continue on. Oaths. Oh boy. Yeah, I'm going to have to do it. This one, I got to tell you, I take a little bit of a different view than many of my peers do. But let's talk about it. It begins in verse 33. Again, that you have heard that it was said to those of old, you shall not swear falsely, but shall perform to the Lord what you have sworn. But I say to you, do not take an oath at all, either by heaven, for it is the throne of God, or by the earth, for it is his footstool, or by Jerusalem, for it is the city of the great king. And do not take an oath by your head, for you cannot make one hair white or black. Let what you say simply be yes or no. Anything more than this comes from evil. I am going to try as best as I can to represent what most of my peers would probably say about this section. Most of them would probably say that this is not Jesus saying you can't ever say, I promise something or whatever, but rather he's just going against the times of the day where people would play games with oaths, and he mentions in other places in the Bible that they would do that, right? Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, for you say that if one swears by the temple, it is nothing, but by the gold by the temple, then they do have to follow it, or something like that. That's actually within the woes that Jesus pronounced, and we're going to be getting to that fairly soon, I believe. Here's the problem, and here's why I don't really buy that. The conclusion from that is then, if Jesus, what Jesus was actually saying was that you got to keep all of your oaths, which is exactly what he says he's not saying. It says, again, in verse 33, you have heard that it was said to those of old, you shall not swear falsely, but shall perform to the Lord what you have sworn. You will keep everything that you have done. I don't think that's what he's saying. I think what he is saying here is exactly what the plain reading of the scripture is, which is that Christians really shouldn't be taking oaths at all. That means I don't honestly think, and it's not something that I'm gonna, go on a crusade over. But um, honestly, I think that the phrase "I promise" really shouldn't be used in a serious way in the Christian vocabulary. Some people who know I have this opinion have made fun of me before for using it in a joking way, but I've also made jokes about killing people before. It doesn't mean I actually believe it. Um, the this okay, so here's why I think it tells us to do this. First of all, let me point out that there are a couple other scriptures that would seem to indicate this. Look over to Proverbs chapter 17. Proverbs 17, verse 18. One who lacks sense gives a pledge and puts up security in the presence of his neighbor. I certainly am very much against preaching personal wisdom because personal wisdom is fickle and fallible. But we are, as Christians, supposed to be wise as serpents. That's what Jesus told us to do. We have a commandment to be wise. Difficult to do, especially when it's hard to know what is wise, and sometimes we can be pretty confident of it, but you can be 100% confident of it if the Bible says this is wise. The Bible says it's not wise to put anything more into a promise than just yes or no. And again, the book of James says in chapter 5 and verse 12, but above all, my brothers, do not swear either by heaven or by earth or by any other oath, but let your yes be yes and your no be no, so that you may not fall under condemnation. I mean, so here's the thing with it. One, I don't think you ever see the result of, and by the way, back up for a second. A lot of times people will point out that you see angels or God making promises within the Bible. Yes, God is allowed to do certain things that he's also allowed to command us not to do, right? There's a lot of things that God can do that I can't, and I think making promises is one of those things. But part of it, that Jesus' point is that if I make a promise, it doesn't make any sense because I have no control over the world. I don't have really the ability to make those sorts of guarantees. Even the phrase "I promise" itself, if you think about it, doesn't really make any sense. Look, if I say, "I promise to you I'm going to do this," what am I saying? I'm saying I'm being especially honest right now. You can be assured of this. But here's the problem with that. There's no such thing as degrees of honesty. You are either honest or you are not. What you are saying, to the best of your knowledge, is true or it is not. So if I'm saying I'm being especially honest, I can't be talking about a level of quality of honesty. I must be talking about quantity of honesty, which would indicate then that there are some times that I am dishonest. But right now I'm being honest, which actually makes you seem less honest. It doesn't make any sense. So anyway, by the way, you can look at the example of Jephthah to see that there's no good to be coming from promises. Here's the point. Like I said, I'm not mad at you if you don't agree with me. I have plenty of friends who are wrong. But to me, this very much seems to be a command. Don't make these promises. There's no point of it. Don't swear on your mother's grave. Don't, because you have no control over that. Don't swear by the hair of your head. You don't have any control over that. Don't swear by your own honesty. Just let your yes be yes and your no be no. And of course, we can all agree on this, that the Christian should not be honest only when they say "I promise" or something along those lines. But a yes from a Christian ought to be better than the promise of somebody of the world, or at least that's what Jesus expects of us. I'm not saying that's how it ends up, but that's how it ought to be. One last little challenge, as a little bit of me egging you on if you're not quite in agreement with me on this one. Again, I'm not particularly upset about it, but one more little challenge. If it were the case, if you think I'm wrong and the Bible does not teach that the Christians should not be taking oaths at all, if that were the case, if Jesus really did want you to not be taking any oaths or saying "I promise" or anything like that, but anything stronger than yes or no, How else is he supposed to say it? How could he have made that any more clear? Food for thought. Two more to go. This next one is the one I referenced at the beginning that we saw in the 9/11 museum. Verse 38. You have heard that it was said, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. But I say to you, do not resist the one who is evil. But if anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to him the other also. And if anyone would sue you and take away your tunic, let him have your cloak as well. And if anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go with him 2 miles. Give to the one who begs from you, and do not refuse the one who would borrow from you. Jesus teaches here against the concept of retaliation. Now, this one is a little more interesting because here he makes direct contradiction, or at least it would appear to be direct contradiction to Old Testament. I'm going to explain why it's actually not. But the first one, you'll recall, do not kill. And he says, don't even be angry. That's not contradiction, that's expanding on the concept. When before you have do not commit adultery, and I say you don't even lust after a woman, again, that's not breaking the concept, that's expanding the concept. Divorce, very much, this one's not really a case of expanding so much, it is clarification. The oaths thing, again, you don't really have, I don't think there's a contradiction in the Old Testament here. If you do make an oath, you should keep it. I think that's even true as a Christian. But really, it's best if you just don't make the oath in the first place. This is the first time where it would appear to be direct contradiction to one from the other. And it's why context is going to matter a lot. Once again, eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. There's a Latin term for this law. It's called lex talionis. It is found within the Old Testament, multiple occasions as a matter of fact. Here's the concept within it. It's that the punishment should fit the crime. It's very similar to what we see at the Code of Hammurabi. And a lot of people, when they see that, they think it's a code of cruelty. No, it's the exact opposite. It's that you should not punish any more severely than the amount of damage that has been received in the initial crime. So, if I get into a fight with somebody, and the other guy ends up losing an eye in this, you can put out my eye as retaliation for that, as justice for that, and then no more. You're not allowed to kill me over it. You're not allowed to put out both of my eyes, because justice demands punishment fits the crime. That's the idea behind eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. But then Jesus says this, you don't do that. Somebody slaps you on one cheek, you turn the other. Now, why does he say that, and how is this not contradiction? It's because it's about context. When Jesus says this, and one of the things, I think this is one of the reasons why the Old Testament is so incredibly important, because we need to understand the differences in these contexts. The Old Testament teaches us what justice is. Justice is this: punishments fitting crimes. But then Jesus says in the New Testament, now that you understand what justice is, now that you understand it, you don't seek it for yourself. Keep in mind that the Old Testament, part of its job is not just to give spiritual guidance to the Israelites and then later the Jews, but it's also to give temporal guidance, meaning that the nation itself, its laws are also written into the Old Testament. So you have things that are just completely aspiritual in nature, such as a tax code, right, in the Old Testament. That's there as well. Certainly, the government that's set up would be what we describe as a theocracy, but it still has to set up government functions. The New Testament is freed from that restraint entirely. And so it just tells us about the spiritual laws. And so Jesus says, you have heard that it was said eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. You understand that if somebody puts out your eye or a tooth, the just thing for that to happen to them is for them to lose an eye or a tooth. I say to you, if someone puts out your eye, you forgive them instead. Yes, this is just. Now, you don't seek justice for yourself. That's what you do, Christian. Keep in mind, by the way, another law of justice in the universe is that the soul who sins will die. And Jesus did not seek justice in that, and instead sought mercy. So there's a thought with that. It should also be mentioned the potential pacifist ideas that come from here. This is another place that I kind of think I fall a little bit differently than some of my peers. Historically, within the church, there have been full-on pacifists. Based on this section, they would think you have no violence for any reason ever. I don't go that far with it. I will say this. I have a hard time reconciling this with the idea that I have a perfect right to self-defense. Keep in mind that, once again, Jesus did not defend himself from his own death, nor do we have records of the apostles or any of the martyrs defending themselves from their own deaths. And in fact, when Peter tried to defend Jesus, Jesus rebukes him for it. That being said, I'm not a total pacifist. I have a hard time justifying my own self-defense. I will say this, I think people go too far when they say this also means you cannot defend others. That's a totally different ballgame to me. I believe it's more noble to defend others than to defend oneself. And I have seen nowhere in the Bible where defending others is condemned. So no, I don't have a problem with somebody entering the military. I might have a problem with some of the things they do while in the military. Just because you're in the military doesn't suddenly, remove you from moral obligation. This is an extreme example, but if an officer orders you to murder a child while you're in the military, you don't murder the child. And yeah, that might have some pretty extreme consequences, but once again, that's what the Christian ought to do. Anyway, I think it is acceptable to defend somebody else. Jesus does not go so far as to say, if somebody slaps your family on the cheek, then you take your child's head and turn the other also. I don't think he goes that far. But it is hard for me personally to justify a law of self-defense, which, by the way, people refer to somehow as if it's an objective moral thing that you have a right to self-defense, where the Bible never really says that. At least to my knowledge. If you know better, please correct me, but I don't think it says anything along those lines. So it's hard for me to justify self-defense in this. There are acts of violence I think are perfectly justified, and if you want to call me out on hypocrisy, here's one. I've done I've done a tough man contest before. I think boxing is perfectly fine because you have two people who have consented to do violence to one another. Very limited violence from what you could be doing, but nevertheless, I think that's fine. I don't think there's a problem with that. I don't have a problem with people being soldiers so long as they're in a righteous cause and are acting righteously within there. And of course, the Bible even tells us that there are times where somebody can act in a violent manner. In the book of Romans, chapter 13, it tells us that the government does not bear the sword in vain. A lot of Christians think that it's immoral for the government to execute people. Well, that's not what the Bible says. God has given the right to governments to, yes, even execute people. They also, by the way, that doesn't mean they're obligated to do it, but they do have the right to do it. And so I think it's possible to be a Christian executioner. But you'll notice that it's not those personal times. It's not about self-defense. It's about something greater than the self. Certainly that's a theme to the Antitheses. Greater than yourself. Stop thinking about what you want and think about greater, bigger things. Think about Christianity. That's what Jesus is trying to get at. All right. Last one we'll go over. Verse 43. You've heard that it was said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I say to you, love your enemies. Pray for those who persecute you, so that you may be sons of your Father who is in heaven. For he makes his sun rise on the evil and the good, and sends his rain on the just and on the unjust. For if you love those who love you, what reward do you have? Do not even the tax collectors do the same? And if you greet only your brothers, what more are you doing than others? Do not even the Gentiles do the same? You therefore must be perfect, as your heavenly Father is perfect. Jesus says that you should love your enemies. This is the only one in this section, by the way, which there is no Old Testament basis. All the other ones you can find in the Old Testament where he says it. Here he says, you have heard that it was said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. The Old Testament never says this. Here he's not addressing Old Testament. He's addressing the traditions of his people who very much believed they ought to hate their enemies. He says, you got to love your enemies. Do good to those who persecute you. Really, this is almost an expounding on the retaliation idea. Right? I mean, he's describing doing good to those who persecute you. Going the second mile, that's referencing a law that a Roman soldier could make a non-Roman citizen carry their burden for no further than 1 mile. But they could force them to do it. When he says go the second mile, that's doing good to somebody who's persecuting you. So it's very much a lot of the same concept as the first one. You've heard that it was said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. Jesus says, no. This one is a complete antithesis to what was said before. But love your enemy. You'll notice, by the way, he didn't say have no enemies. I think some people think that means you should have no enemies at all. No, because if you're living the Christian life, you're going to have enemies because Christ had enemies. The point is, don't have enemies because of your actions. Rather, you give somebody every opportunity to be your friend instead. When he says, don't just love those who love you, don't the tax collectors even do the same? At this time, the tax collectors were a group of people who were very despised by the Jews, and many of them were some wicked men. He's not making a generalization about everybody who has ever, worked as a tax collector, but anybody who does so sinfully. Basically, these people, they're doing the same thing. Even bad people love those who love them. That's his point with it. The same idea with the Gentiles. If you want to be different, if you want to be that light of the world, if you want to be light on top of the hill and the salt of the earth, then you got to be better than that. Not in an arrogant way, not in a holier than thou way, but in choosing to love those, even those who do bad to you. And once again, the examples we see within the Bible are consistently that. All of the time you see that. Again, I've made reference to the martyrs. Look at what Stephen says when he's about to get killed sometime. What is he more concerned about than anything else? He's more concerned about the spiritual state of those who are murdering him. Jesus said something very similar during his own crucifixion. The Antitheses. Is there anything difficult to understand about them? I don't think so. There's a couple of them, I admit. There's debate about it, but I don't think there's anything difficult to understand here. But these are super difficult to apply. This is the kind of stuff within the scriptures that if you're a Christian and you're walking in the light, and you're trying to improve yourself as a person, which is part of what Christianity is about, the slow, incremental traveling towards perfection that you know you're never going to really achieve, but that you're striving for. This is the super advanced stuff. This is the stuff that's going to get you for the rest of your life. And I know when you hear some of this, like, how am I ever going to do it? Man, I don't know, because I fail in a lot of these. I wish I were perfect in it, but I know I'm not. All I can do is hope to strive towards this goal of perfection. Could you imagine what kind of place the world would be if they all lived this section of the Sermon on the Mount? I think we'd be out a lot of our troubles, personally. All right. Appreciate you bearing with me through that. We are at 48 minutes, which is not bad at all. I was afraid we were going to be at in about an hour and a half when we were done with all of this. We are not done with the Sermon on the Mount. However, we still got 2 more chapters of Matthew to go with it. It was a long sermon, and there's a lot more to cover. But certainly, this is, I think, worthy of a lot of time spent on it. So thank you for being here with me. I hope you join us next week. Until then, I love you all. Look forward to seeing you then.